One building judged a king, another crowns his successors, a small church in between buried his opponents. This is Westminster, where a medieval hall, a Gothic abbey, and a modest parish church stand within a single World Heritage Site. This video follows how this cluster grew from a marshy island to the heart of a modern capital, why UNESCO protects it, and how it came to shape so much of British public life. In England, on the north bank of the River Thames, the Palace of Westminster stands in the borough known as the City of Westminster, close to other government buildings that line Whitehall. The World Heritage Site called Palace of Westminster and Westminster Abbey, including St Margaret's Church, brings together three elements in this tight area: the palace with the UK Parliament, Westminster Abbey, and the smaller St Margaret's Church beside it. For travel and tourism, this is one of the easiest places to reach in London. Westminster Underground Station opens almost directly onto the river and the palace, served by the Circle, District, and Jubilee lines. St James's Park and Waterloo stations are all within walking distance, connecting the site to national rail lines and major bus routes. For viewers who read a tube map like a story, the Exploria shop offers posters, puzzles, cups, and shirts built around metro diagrams from London and other famous destinations, so the routes of a trip can stay on the wall or in the wardrobe. Check the link in the description. From Heathrow, Gatwick, Stansted, Luton, or London City airports, trains and express buses bring visitors into central London, where the underground and local buses complete the journey. The site sits where royal, religious, and political life concentrated over centuries. Slightly raised ground near a historic river crossing, outside the old commercial city of London, yet close enough to control it. That position helped turn this corner into a national stage. Today, all of that is compressed into a short walk around Parliament Square, raising a question that guides the next chapter. How did a riverside royal complex from the 11th century evolve into the modern World Heritage Site seen today? Long before there was a skyline of towers, Westminster was a small, marshy island in the Thames called Thorney Island. In early 970, King Edgar and St Dunstan set up a Benedictine community here, part of a wider reform that aimed to strengthen disciplined monasteries under royal protection. Placing monks on this island gave the crown a loyal religious house close to London, but slightly apart from the bustle and politics of the old city. In the 1040s, Edward the Confessor took that modest monastery and turned it into the centerpiece of his rule. He decided to build a grand stone abbey in honor of St. Peter on Thorney Island, and to re-endow the Benedictine house that already stood there. To stay close to the project, he had a royal palace built right beside the work, so he could oversee the construction of both his church and his residence. The new abbey was completed around 1060 and consecrated in 1065, just before Edward's death, quickly becoming both his burial place and the setting for later coronations. Edward was not the first ruler to notice this site. Earlier in the 11th century, Canute the Great, the Danish king who ruled England from 1016 to 1035 and later controlled Denmark and Norway, had already begun building a royal residence on Thorney Island. His reign stabilized England after years of Viking attacks, and the small palace near the monastery reflected Westminster's growing importance as a secure riverside base linked to both the sea routes and the emerging royal administration. Edward's later palace and abbey rose over a landscape that Canute had already started to shape. The third part of today's World Heritage Ensemble, St Margaret's Church, would come slightly later. In these first centuries, the abbey itself served local laypeople as well as the monks, but by the 12th century, a separate parish church dedicated to St Margaret of Antioch was founded within the abbey precincts. By the time of the Norman conquest in 1066, the basic pattern was set: a royal monastery, a riverside palace, and a growing settlement clustered around them. William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy, who defeated King Harold at the Battle of Hastings and became King of England, was crowned in Edward the Confessor's church on Christmas Day that year. Almost every English and later British monarch followed in the same place. Beside the abbey, the royal palace grew in scale and ambition. Between 1097 and 1099, William II built Westminster Hall, a great hall that was among the largest in Europe at the time. At first, it served for lavish feasts and major gatherings, where kings used its size to project authority during Whitsun and other high festivals. Over the 12th and 13th centuries, the character of the hall shifted. In 1215, King John's barons forced him to grant Magna Carta, a charter that tried to limit royal power and protect certain customs and legal processes. One clause required the common pleas to be held in a fixed place, and Westminster Hall became the usual home for these royal courts. King's Bench, common pleas, and chancery gathered under its roof, making the palace a legal as well as a residential center. In 1265, Simon de Montfort, the nobleman who led a rebellion against Henry III, summoned a parliament at Westminster that brought not just lords, but also knights and townsmen into the discussion. With that, a hall built for royal banquets became the backdrop for early experiments in wider political representation. Inside the abbey precincts, the growing town around the palace created pressure of its own. The Benedictine monks followed a strict rhythm of prayer, and constant requests from local laypeople were hard to manage. In the 12th century, St Margaret's Church was founded just outside the main abbey church, so that townspeople and those working in and around the palace could worship in their own simpler parish building. Dedicated to St Margaret of Antioch, it absorbed baptisms, marriages, and daily services, while the abbey focused more on monastic liturgy, royal burials, and great ceremonies. In 1245, Westminster was already dense with meaning. Henry III began rebuilding the abbey in the new Gothic style, hoping to rival the great churches of France and to honor Edward the Confessor with a rich new shrine. By the 14th century, the King's Great Hall and its surrounding chambers had become the regular stage for assemblies that looked more and more like a permanent parliament. The Palace of Westminster stayed a royal residence, but its identity was shifting. The space where English kings lived was also where they had to negotiate with the realm. Law and pageantry had to share a single space. In the 1390s, Richard II decided that this hall, already old by medieval standards, needed a new face. The king ordered a major remodeling that covered many of its Norman details and introduced the vast timber hammer beam roof that still astonishes visitors today. Royal carpenter Hugh Herland designed the structure, while master mason Henry Yeovil reshaped the stonework. The result was a hall that felt more modern and more royal at the same time, an engineering achievement that allowed the interior to stay open without central supports, framing both courts and ceremonies beneath a single dramatic span of oak. Across the yard, Westminster Abbey continued to grow into a national shrine. Henry III's Gothic rebuilding wrapped the older Romanesque church in a taller, lighter shell, with soaring vaults and rich sculpture. Monks met in the new octagonal chapter house, begun around 1246, where tiered stone seats could hold large gatherings. In the later 13th and 14th centuries, this chapter house also hosted meetings of the Commons, the developing lower part of Parliament, before they gained their own dedicated space in St Stephen's Chapel. St Margaret's, meanwhile, carried the everyday weight of parish life. By 1500, the three buildings already carried distinct roles that overlapped constantly. All three stood within a short walk of each other, in a quarter that was turning into a natural focus for power and ritual. St Margaret's Church had fallen into such disrepair by the late 15th century that it needed almost complete reconstruction. Under Henry VII, work began around 1486 and continued into the early 16th century, producing the late medieval church that largely survives today. But religious stability did not last. In the 1530s, Henry VIII's break with Rome led to the dissolution of the monasteries. Westminster's Benedictine community surrendered the abbey to the crown in 1540. Monastic life ended, but the buildings were too important to lose. While the abbey's status shifted, the political world next door was also changing. Kings had begun summoning representatives from counties and towns, knights of the shire and burgesses, to join lords and clergy in Parliament, especially when new taxes were needed. These representatives increasingly sat and deliberated together in one chamber, separate from the nobles and bishops. That group became known as the Commons, while the higher clergy and nobility formed the Lords. By the 16th century, this House of Commons had a permanent home inside the palace. St. Stephen's Chapel, originally a royal chapel built in the 13th and 14th centuries, was adapted to serve as the Commons' chamber. St Margaret's moved even closer to Parliament in this era. In 1614, it was formally recognized as the parish church of the Palace of Westminster. Many members of the Commons, especially those with more Protestant and later Puritan leanings, preferred its simpler services to the more elaborate liturgy of the Abbey. The 17th century brought open conflict. During the English Civil War, Westminster Hall hosted one of the most dramatic episodes in British history. In January 1649, after years of fighting between royalists and parliamentarians, Charles I was tried in the Hall by a High Court of Justice. Under the hammer-beam roof remodeled in Richard II's time, the king refused to recognize the court's authority, but was condemned for high treason and executed outside Whitehall's banqueting house soon after. With the king dead, England entered the interregnum, first a commonwealth, then a protectorate under Oliver Cromwell and his son. From 1649 to 1660, the monarchy and the House of Lords were abolished, and Republican experiments reshaped how power was supposed to work. That arrangement ended in 1660, when political crisis after Cromwell's death led to the recall of Charles II from exile and the formal restoration of the Stuart monarchy. The return of the king brought back bishops to the Lords and re-established the traditional link between crown, church, and parliament. By 1700, the three Westminster buildings had survived religious upheavals, civil war, the abolition of the monarchy, and its restoration. By the early 18th century, the royal family had long since shifted its main residence from Westminster to Whitehall, after a fire in 1512 destroyed much of the palace's domestic quarters. What remained at Westminster was a patchwork complex focused on Parliament, law courts, and offices, spread through medieval and Tudor buildings that had been altered again and again. As the British state grew after the 1707 union with Scotland and the expansion of overseas empire, this old fabric had to carry more business, more staff, and more paper than it had ever been built to handle. Westminster Hall still anchored the complex as a working law court under its vast timber roof, while the Commons sat cramped in the old St. Stephen's Chapel, a medieval room that no longer matched the size or needs of Parliament. Across the square, Westminster Abbey was steadily becoming a national memorial church, with Poets' Corner turning into a recognized cluster of literary graves, and St Margaret served as the Commons parish church, now marked by a striking Tudor-era Flemish window at its east end. By the early 19th century, this whole ensemble, palace, abbey, and parish church, was doing far more work than its aging fabric was designed for, leaving the palace in particular one serious accident away from disaster. On the evening of 16th October, 1834, a routine act of housekeeping set centuries of history on fire. Clerks from the Exchequer had been told to dispose of obsolete wooden tally sticks, an old accounting system that had finally been replaced. The sticks were fed all day into two underfloor stoves beneath the House of Lords. The flues were narrow, worn, and lined with soot, and the fires were pushed far hotter than they were meant to run. By around 6:30 p.m., witnesses saw flames bursting through the floor of the Lord's chamber. Within hours, the medieval Palace of Westminster was burning in what became the largest fire in London since 1666. The blaze spread through roof timbers and paneling with frightening speed. Only a few major medieval structures survived: Westminster Hall, the undercroft chapel of St Mary, parts of the cloisters, the chapter house and the jewel tower, saved by a change of wind and focused firefighting around the hall. Government could not simply move elsewhere. Parliament still had to meet, laws still had to be passed, and the courts still needed a home. In 1835, a royal commission announced a public competition for the design of a new Palace of Westminster. There was one striking condition: the style had to be Gothic or Elizabethan, not classical. From 97 entries, the winning scheme came from Charles Barry, an architect whose earlier work had been mostly in classical forms. Barry's plan laid out a long riverside facade and a clear internal axis linking the Lords and Commons. But for the detailed Gothic character, he turned to a much younger collaborator, Augustus Welby Pugin. Pugin, a passionate advocate of medieval architecture, drew the tracery, vaults, paneling, furniture and fittings that gave the new palace its distinctive Gothic revival skin. Construction began in 1840 and stretched across decades. The result looked medieval at a glance, but hid iron beams, flues, heating systems, and offices that were very much 19th century solutions to the needs of a modern parliament. Across the square, Westminster Abbey entered its own Victorian phase. From 1849, Sir George Gilbert Scott served as surveyor of the fabric and led major restorations, work on the chapter house and north porches, a new altar and reredos, and repairs to worn stonework. St Margaret's Church stood close to the drama in 1834, but escaped the flames. By the late 19th century, the Westminster ensemble looked settled. A medieval hall and abbey, a parish church with Tudor and later layers, and a vast new Gothic revival palace tying them together along the Thames. At the start of the 20th century, the Palace of Westminster was firmly established as the working heart of British politics. The complex was busy, but it still relied on 19th century services and structures as the pressures of a modern democratic state increased. Across the square, Westminster Abbey continued as the stage for royal and national ceremonies. After the First World War, the body of an unidentified serviceman, the unknown warrior, was buried just inside the west door of the nave to stand for all those killed in war with no known grave. St Margaret's Church became a favored place for parliamentary society weddings. Among the most famous was the marriage of Winston Churchill and Clementine Hozier in September 1908, followed later by the weddings of future Prime Minister Harold Macmillan and Lord Louis Mountbatten in the 1920s. The Second World War brought a new kind of test. Between 1940 and 1941, German air raids hit the Palace of Westminster on multiple occasions. On the night of 10th to 11th May 1941, incendiary bombs caused the worst damage. The roof of Westminster Hall caught fire, and the Commons Chamber was heavily hit. Firefighters managed to save the medieval hall, but the Victorian Commons Chamber was completely destroyed. In the post-war years, a new Commons Chamber had to be created inside a damaged but still functioning palace. Architect Sir Giles Gilbert Scott was tasked with designing the replacement. He kept the basic size and rectangular plan of the old chamber, with benches facing each other, to preserve the familiar confrontational style of debate that had grown out of St. Stephen's Chapel and the Victorian Room. Westminster Abbey also lived through the war years as both sanctuary and symbol. In the decades that followed, it hosted events broadcast worldwide: the coronation of George VI in 1937, the coronation of Elizabeth II in 1953, and major royal weddings and funerals. St. Margaret's, the church on Parliament Square, continued its quieter work through these upheavals. By the 1970s, the Palace of Westminster was clearly showing its age. Through the late 20th century and into the 21st, maintenance kept the building going, but the list of problems kept lengthening. In the 2000s, this crystallized into what is now known as the Restoration and Renewal Program, a long-term plan to overhaul the palace's mechanical and electrical services, improve fire safety, remove asbestos, and repair damaged stonework, while still allowing Parliament to function. Nothing on this scale has been attempted at Westminster since Barry and Pugin rebuilt the palace in the 19th century. One part of the ensemble has already been through a full transformation. From 2017 to 2022, the Elizabeth Tower, home of the Great Clock and the bell known as Big Ben, was wrapped in scaffolding for the most extensive conservation work in its history. Westminster Abbey's recent story has also combined continuity and change. In 2018, it opened the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Galleries in the medieval Triforium, more than 16 meters above the nave floor, displaying around 300 treasures from its collections in a space that had never before been open to the public. St Margaret's Church has undergone quieter but significant changes. In 1972, an Act of Parliament transferred its parish responsibilities to neighboring parishes and brought the church directly under the Dean and chapter of Westminster Abbey. Today, the cluster of the Palace, the Abbey and St Margaret's, operates under constant tension between daily use and long-term repair. All three sit at the center of one of London's busiest destinations for travel and tourism. From the river, the Palace of Westminster looks like a stone cliff of towers and spires stretched along the north bank of the Thames. At one end rises the Elizabeth Tower, 96 meters high, with its 4 clock faces and the bell known as Big Ben. At the other stands the taller Victoria Tower, once the largest square stone tower in the world, now filled with miles of parliamentary archives, including original Acts of Parliament and historic documents such as the Bill of Rights and the death warrant of Charles I. Many travelers arrive thinking only of a quick photo of the clock, yet the real experience unfolds inside, in a sequence of rooms built for power, ceremony, and everyday work. Most tours start in Westminster Hall. Its vast hammer-beam roof hosts exhibitions, lying in state ceremonies and major speeches. From there, the path often leads through St. Stephen's Hall. Statues of key politicians line the walls, while doorways and tablets hint at vanished partitions and screens. At the center of the palace, everything narrows into the central lobby. This octagonal hall, directly under the central tower, is the crossroads of the building. One corridor runs to the Lords, another to the Commons, a third back to Westminster Hall, and a fourth towards committee rooms and libraries. The old practice of waiting here to speak to a representative is what gave the word lobbying its political meaning. At the far end sits the robbing room, where the monarch prepares for the ceremony surrounded by murals of King Arthur painted by William Dyce. Next comes the Royal Gallery, a long hall lined with large paintings of battles like Trafalgar and Waterloo, used today for state receptions. These rooms are not museums. They are still part of a working route for ceremonies. The Lord's Chamber itself is the most elaborate interior in the palace. Red benches, rich carving, and the royal throne at one end reflect its role as the place where monarch, lords, and commons come together at the state opening. Across the central lobby, the Commons chamber feels deliberately more restrained. The chair itself, a gift from Australia carved from black bean wood, carries inscriptions about law and liberty and a bag for public petitions hanging behind it. In a city full of famous landmarks and World Heritage Sites, this is one of the few places where a journey for sightseeing overlaps so closely with the daily running of a state. On the south side of Parliament Square, Westminster Abbey rises behind its twin west towers. Inside this church lie around 3,300 burials and memorials, from kings and queens to poets, scientists and statesmen, all within a building that still hosts daily worship as well as major royal events. Most visitors enter through the nave. The first impression is vertical. Tall, clustered columns, ribbed vaults, and light filtered through stained glass. Underfoot, Grave slabs cover almost every inch of floor. Towards the east end, the nave narrows into the Coronation Theatre. In front of the high altar stretches the Cosmati pavement, a 13th century inlaid floor of colored stone and glass where monarchs sit during coronations. Just behind the altar stands the shrine of Edward the Confessor, surrounded by medieval royal tombs. Not far away is the coronation chair, carved for Edward I around 1300 and used at almost every coronation since 1308. The chair once held the Stone of Scone under its seat. The stone is now in Scotland, but returns for coronations, linking Westminster to older traditions of kingship. Behind the high altar sits the Henry VII Lady Chapel, often described as one of the most intricate late medieval interiors in England. Fan-vaulted ceilings spread overhead like carved stone lace, picked out with Tudor roses and heraldic badges. Here lie Henry VII and his queen, as well as many other Tudor and Stuart figures. The chapel is also the spiritual home of the Order of the Bath, whose knights' stalls line the walls with carved canopies and hanging banners. In the south transept, the atmosphere changes again. This is Poets' Corner, the cluster of graves and memorials that grew up around Geoffrey Chaucer's burial in 1400 and now includes more than 100 writers and literary figures. Names such as Chaucer, Charles Dickens, the Bronte sisters, Jane Austen, and many others appear on stones, plaques, and statues. Some are buried here. Others are commemorated with memorials only. Step outside into the cloisters and the pace drops. These covered walks, dating back to the medieval monastery, open onto a quiet garth of grass. Below the church, the Pyx Chamber and other undercrofts preserve thick stone walls and vaults from Edward the Confessor's 11th century abbey. All of this takes place in a church that still maintains a full pattern of worship. Daily services continue, some with choral music, and large events such as royal weddings, funerals, and national services of remembrance occasionally close parts of the building or alter visiting hours. Between the Palace of Westminster and Westminster Abbey stands a smaller building that many visitors almost miss at first glance, St Margaret's Church. Inside, the church is defined by its light and its glass. At the east end, a large Flemish stained glass window dominates the chancel. Created in the early 16th century in Holland to mark the marriage of Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII, it took a long and complicated route before finally arriving here in 1758, when St Margaret's bought it to adorn the rebuilt chancel. Other windows add more stories. Several commemorate figures closely tied to English printing, exploration, and politics. William Caxton, England's first printer and a parishioner here. Sir Walter Raleigh, executed in Old Palace Yard and buried in the church. And John Milton, who lived in the parish. The monuments and floor slabs underline how closely the church is woven into parliamentary life. Names on the walls and stones include explorers, courtiers, politicians, and writers. In a single loop around the interior, the connection between faith and politics becomes clear. The Palace of Westminster and Westminster Abbey, including St Margaret's Church, was inscribed on the World Heritage List in 1987 as a cultural site, with a minor boundary change approved in 2008. It is listed under Criterion 1, Masterpiece of Human Creative Genius. Westminster Abbey is recognized as an exceptional sequence of English Gothic design, from the 13th century rebuilding under Henry III to later additions like the Henry VII Lady Chapel. Criterion 2, Important Interchange of Human Values. The Abbey not only shaped medieval English church building, it also directly inspired Charles Barry and Augustus Pugin when they created the 19th century Palace of Westminster in Gothic Revival style. Criterion 4, Outstanding example of a type of architectural ensemble. Together, the palace, the abbey, and St Margaret's Church show how monarchy, church and parliament have shared the same ground since the 11th century. Royal tombs and the chapter house in the Abbey, Westminster Hall, the Lords and Commons chambers in the Palace, and the Commons Parish Church at St Margaret's form a continuous architectural record of England's shift from feudal kingship to a modern parliamentary system. UNESCO also highlights that all three buildings still serve their original functions. Parliament meets in the Palace, the Abbey remains the coronation and memorial church, and St Margaret's continues its link to the Commons. Their setting by the Thames and their shared skyline are seen as part of the site's value, which is why current restoration works and controls on new high-rise buildings focus so strongly on protecting both the fabric and the views of this World Heritage destination. In one small corner of London, the Palace of Westminster, Westminster Abbey, and St Margaret's Church bring together almost 1,000 years of politics, worship, and daily life. Debates in the Commons, coronations in the Abbey, and quiet services in St Margaret's all share the same streets, turning this part of the Thames into one of the most concentrated heritage destinations in the world of travel and tourism. For anyone planning a trip, this cluster is more than a stop for photos. It is a place where visitors can walk through Westminster Hall, stand near the coronation chair, read names in Poets' Corner, and step into the Commons' own parish church, all within a short walk across Parliament Square. If this video helped make Westminster clearer or added new details to a future visit, a like and a subscription help the channel keep explorations of World Heritage sites and other remarkable places coming. Comments are welcome. Which of the three buildings would be first on your list to visit, and what surprised you most about their history? To keep traveling through some of the world's most important heritage destinations, continue to the next video in the playlist and see how another city, landscape, or monument tells its own story of power, memory, and tourism.